This is Y376 International Political Economy, October 9, 2008. This lecture is about the origins and consequences of the debt crisis. The recession in the industrial world after the price increases of the 1970s meant that banks had to find borrowers elsewhere, and particularly in the developing world. Petrodollar cycling was the name of this effort. Growth in the developing world was hurt by the anti-inflationary policies adopted at the end of the 1970s, and therefore set up the conditions for the global debt crisis. The developing countries who had borrowed money during the 1970s found it more and more difficult to repay their loans. This shows the price increases of the 1970s, and that was what set up the situation that created the world debt crisis. Basically, the oil importing industrialized countries provided money in the form of payment for petroleum imports to the oil exporting countries. The oil exporting countries couldn't spend all that money, so they deposited it in international banks to insulate their economies from the possible inflationary effects of all that additional cash. The international banks were expected to pay interest on those deposits, and so they couldn't lend the money to the oil importing countries, so they loaned them instead to third world countries. Third world countries used some of that money to pay for their own increased oil import costs. Now, like I said before, there's a shortage of traditional borrowers for the money that flowed to the oil exporting countries. And some developing countries looked like good risks because they had high growth rates, and or because they had their own petroleum or raw material exports. Good examples would be Venezuela, Nigeria, and Mexico. This chart shows the increase in debt in three categories of developing countries between 1970 and 1999. The most important increase in debt was among the severely indebted countries, mostly fast-growing, fairly large economies like Mexico and Brazil. But in fact, debt grew in the other categories of countries as well, and it became a problem later on. When it was difficult to pay back some of the loans in the 1980s, from the 1980s on, some of the debt had to be renegotiated and rescheduled, just the way people have to renegotiate and reschedule their mortgage payments when they have difficulty paying back their mortgage. We need a little bit more of that in the current mortgage crisis. Anyway, there were negotiations between borrowing countries and creditors, mostly private banks. The International Monetary Fund got involved in endorsing structural adjustment programs as a way of kind of guaranteeing that any new loans would not go down the tubes. And part of those structural adjustment programs was a commitment to reduce government spending, to reduce government deficits, to devalue the currency, and to promote exports, which meant abandoning some of the import substitution policies of the past. There are problems in getting these negotiations completed. The banks and the debtor countries had a conflict over what's called moral hazard. That is, the banks were concerned that if the debtor countries got off too easily, they would borrow too much money in the future or take on risks that they shouldn't take on, and so they wanted there to be some cost for the debtor countries. The banks and the lender countries had conflicts about how non-performing loans should be reported. The governments of the home governments of the banks that were had bad loans wanted them to report those, the fact that they were non-performing as soon as possible, whereas the banks were concerned about hurting their share prices and so forth. Also, the larger banks that tended to be involved in loan consortia, that is, groups of banks lending new money to developing countries, sometimes had to kind of beat the heads of the smaller banks to put in more capital to as part of the renegotiation of debt payments. There have been four basic plans to try to deal with the debt crisis. The first period, 82 to 84, was one of austerity programs where there was some rescheduling and new lending after structural adjustment programs were adopted. From 1985 to 89, we had the Baker Plan, named for Secretary of the Treasury James Baker, during the last half of the Reagan administration. Here there was some new lending and pro-growth policies, but basically debt continued to increase, and so people felt that that was not a long-term solution to the debt crisis. From 1989 on, in the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, a plan was devised by Secretary of the Treasury Nicholas Brady to reduce debt, and I'll talk about that more later. And in 1996, the beginning of the highly indebted, impoverished country program began, which was aimed mainly at reducing the debt of poor countries, very relatively poor countries. Okay, this slide deals with the Baker Plan in 1985. Baker proposed loans to cover interest payments with conditions that the debtor countries privatize state enterprises and subsidies and open their economies to foreign investment. 12 of 15 large debtors complied. I think that included Mexico and Brazil. And however, this shifted the burden of financing to the World Bank, which was a problem for the World Bank. This chart shows there are two indicators of how bad the debt crisis was getting. One is the debt service ratio, that's the blue line, which shows the ratio of debt service, that's interest and principal payments, divided by export revenues, and with the idea that you have to export more to service your debt if your debt goes up. And that ratio got higher and higher until 1986, when it finally started to decline, which is good news. But also the debt service over gross national income, the red line, shows that debt service was continuing to rise relative to national income, which is like a tax on the growth of the economies that were indebted. Okay, the Brady Plan in 1989 sought to attract investment by reforming economies, encouraged cooperating private banks to reduce their claims against developing countries by basically collateralizing debts in the form of bonds. So the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank provided funding to turn the debt from bilateral debt into multilateral debt, and to shift it from the form of loans to bonds. Also, during the 1980s, we had the rise of what are called debt equity swaps. This is where you could pay back some of your debt or reduce your debt by providing equity, that is shares in usually state enterprises. That you wouldn't give a dollar for dollar share value for your debt. You discount it somewhat. But the idea is that the lender would get something of value in exchange for non-performing loans. Chile and Mexico use this to reduce their debt totals. There was also a fairly innovative program called the Debt for Nature Swap. In the United States, this was authorized under the 1998 Tropical Forest Conservation Act. 11 developing countries became partners with the U.S. under that act, including Costa Rica, which basically said that it would not develop the Costa Rican rainforest in exchange for reductions in debt levels. And there's a picture of the rainforest that was involved in that deal. In 1996, the heavily indebted poor country program was started, administered by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Supposed to be more generous. Well, it had to be improved in 1999 because initially the terms were not generous enough to include enough countries to really reduce debt. But in any case, the idea here is to swap some of your debt obligations to be forgiven your debt, basically, in exchange for adopting new spending programs to alleviate poverty. So these are the countries that were involved in the program as of 1999, mostly sub-Saharan African countries. And one of the things that really changed around 2000 was the rise of popular movements to support debt relief in particularly the poor countries. One notable organization is the Jubilee 2000, which was started by Bob Geldof and Bono, two Irish musicians, and involved supporters like Muhammad Ali, Quincy Jones, and Youssou N'Dour. This organization demonstrated at the G8 meeting in Birmingham in 1988, and Prime Minister Tony Blair became a supporter, along with many evangelical Christian groups. The debt service ratio did decline after the beginning of the HIPC program for the countries that decided to join that program. So it's considered to be a relatively successful program. And there's a picture of Bono and Bill Gates at the World Economic Forum talking about things like debt relief and how to help the poor countries.